Well, welcome everyone, and welcome to all the participants and our speakers, Ashish Pitti, Dr. Suel Kadir, Dr. Ghazala, and Sarala, my good old friend. Let me do a quick introduction of all of them. Ashish Pitti has been birding since for almost 4 decades now, and he's an analog birder, a bibliographer, and editor of the Indian Birds Journal. Now it's the 16th year. He's the author of the Birds in Books, 300 Years of South Asian Ornithology, and he's a very old hand in birding, of course, as you can figure out, and he's going to tell us about in birding in general. How we deal with birding in today's life is very different now from before, which has become very digital. And next we have is Suhail Kadir. Suhail Kadir is a scientist at the Nature Conservation Foundation and also part of the Bird Count India team. I know him personally for our eBird work, and we are in touch constantly. He studied the behavior of various species, including Cinereus state, Baya weaver, quails. He currently works primarily in nature education and citizen science, which includes eBird. And then we have Dr. Ghazala Sahabuddin. She's an ecologist and author who started out as a avid birdwatcher with Kalpavrix in Delhi in 1985. A lot of her time has been spent researching bird species, vulnerability to habitat fragmentation, biomass extraction, monocultures, wetland management, and timber working in India. She has worked extensively in Palani Hills, Western Ghats, Sariska, Corbett, Sultanpur, and more recently the oak forest of Kumaon. She is currently affiliated with the Center of Ecology and Development and Research, or CEDAR, in Dehradun, where she is leading a program to promote nature-based ecotourism as a rural livelihood in Uttarakhand. Her book, Conservation at the Crossroads, is framed as an ecologist critique of conservation policies and paradigm adopted in India, based on 20 years of field study and experience. Then we have Dr. Sarala Khaling. She's from Darjeeling, and she did her PhD ecology of Satit Chagopan in Singalila. That's how I know her from those days. After PhD, she worked on biodiversity and people interaction all over North Bengal for her postdoc. And then she worked with WWF Nepal program, coordinating and directing the research monitoring and program development priorities. Then she moved there as a regional coordinator of Critical Ecosystem Partnership Fund for Eastern Himalayas, working with more than 100 local organizations for conservation. And currently, she is the regional director of ATREE, Ashoka Trust for Research in Ecology, based in Sikkim. So I'll start with Ashista. Ashish Pitti, you're on.
Thank you, Sujana. I thank you for this invitation, and I also thank the full audience for taking their time here. I feel privileged to be Suhail, Ghazala, Khaling. So I presume more are already and for quite some time, and so I give a general talk here. My comment I feel bird watching is and how it should be done. You know, the first rule I think, and I tell every birding, is the safety of the bird. Bird comes first, and that should be the rule that you follow birding. Now, there are some tools of classical bird watching that I carry all the time: notebook, pen, binocular, guide. One thing that you should have is a lot of options, because bird watch about and watch. The equipment like cameras and phones are later additions. For the past 5 have taken on some importance. Come to that later. Now, when you go, you should realize that this relationship between a bird watcher and birds is a one-sided affair. The only party interested in this, how deeply we depend deeply we are in the lives of birds. Importance could be fleeting or deep, enough in our or even to theirs, given how we humans are increasingly capable of changing the landscape. Your interpretation of a situation present a new angle of animal. So when you go out birding, there are things that you note all the time that I time, which are standard and given, and you know about it, but it's mention it, which is you write down the date, the time, the place, the weather, what sort of, and the habitat that you are in is very important. That is the thing that is being destroyed fastest. Birds on habitats, and once habitat, the bird, all living as things in that habitat also disappear. Uh, I've always also recorded the names of fellow bird watchers, been on, and if I go out, then the name of the society. One thing one has to decide about birding is whether one wants a tourist or a birder. If you want to be a birder, you go with a shopping list and you birds as you see them in the uh, next bird that you have. It's all right, a minute, at least a friend in you. But if you want a birder, then let us have to do. The first thing I would suggest is that you stay with a bird longer. Stay with it. You might ask how long. So I would say as long as it remains in your view. In this, and you have to note, you try to note everything that the bird does. If you've been reading about, you might think that watching is well known. So I say keep going, for there is a huge difference in reading something and watching it first. You might something not known the bird. This is very always feel we revert to word, oh, you know, tick karo, let's go to the next one. I've done it all also, but there have been moments when I've actually just watched under a tree, and it's a enlightened experience. Now, the fact does remain that I don't use a phone to upload into eBird. I try and write in a notebook, and I do that because writing note involves you physically in around all the simplest of artificial tools. Your writing, what you gets etched in your physics of field are a photograph, such as sound and smell and feelings of joy or fear or peace. And sometimes you do note down those things too, but you can write in your notebook. It becomes more feel sometimes. Never hesitated in making of a bird or any habitat for that matter, field notebook. Slowly over time, as I went on doing this, I think I'm good at it. And I, all of you, also in sketching, see what happens when you think that you do not make a sketch and your what part is what color, etc. And whether you sketch a female or a little man, and you have to augment your augments your notes. Writing becomes more accurate because sometimes while writing, but when you sketch and quickly point things about where there is a blue, there's a wing, there's
next most uh, you're only limited by your ability to look at all the millions and millions of observations that people have contributed. What about distribution? Well known, but look here, these are two very different distribution, each for a bird that's as distinct and unmistakable as ibis. So there's a lot. What happens with the information by birdwatch? We see that black-headed ibis actually is reported the country. There are, but they're certainly not as big as depicted over here. I just want to point out Chhattisgarh, which is this region, which both maps agree saying that they're not found, or perhaps they're found. Let's zoom into Chhattisgarh, the digital platform we can. So here into, this is the area around Raipur. We see that there are lots of individuals of this species. Zoom, click a little, we can see actually where the species has. We can click on the lists, we can look at the date, the people, and so on. And if we look further, this list also has half of the species over here. So confirm that indeed ibis has been found, reported in taking. So this is to do with distribution. And what because eBird is birdwatch the world, not only in India, we can actually for the first begin to look at the migration of across their entire distribution. So the to many of us, the greenish warbler and the green warbler in green, it's very both these species were original species. So the green warbler has a breeding distribution, and the entire population winters in the Indian subcontinent. Greenish warbler has a very extended breeding distribution all across the Tibetan plateau, and again pretty much proportion of wintering birds in. For both these species, India is sort of the custodian of their non-populations. I'll just show one because look at the famous Amur falcon breeds in eastern China, goes through India, across Africa, and then back back down. Again, we can visualize the global migration of this species using information uploaded. About trend, very important from a perspective. How are different doing? How are species increasing? Are they stable? Are they decreasing? And question asked by a consortium of 10 organizations took the 10 plus records from eBird in India and out. And what they did at the abundance trend 25 plus years of 100 species. The current trend over the last and size. These together put Indian species into categories of conservation concern. So 101 classified into high conservation concern, 300 moderate to low conservation, all using data from bird watchers. Here are some examples. White-rumped vulture, it used to have a larger distribution, but it's to particular pockets over here. And this is the graph showing decline. Expected this, this is what the data should have shown. Indeed, it does show it, and it matches very closely with the kinds of surveys that are doing entirely separate. This species is of the highest possible concern. By national bird is distributed all has a very large. If you compare to before the year 2000, there's much higher reporting rate of this species. Species in distribution increase where it was found, and although it's a national in terms of conservation, it's of low as a report. We can also aggregate information from multiple groups of species are doing. So this is for raptors. All are in but the sharpest declines are here for scavengers, which of course in vulture species, but very in open black-winged kite and a whole bunch of large other large open country raptors are also rapidly happening, unlike which we know about. This is without us knowing. First time that there's very clear data extreme work to find out lining and quick place conservers. Otherwise, all our open country raptors are going to trouble. As generalists, woodpeckers are doing better, but still lower than they were before 2000. On the many of us are photographers. You can photographs. There are 7 lakh photos and 35,000 audio recordings there, and of course these photo recordings, days and location, that they can be very useful for exploring a variety of different things. For example, if you look at paradise flycatchers over here, we know that the males come in 2 different morphs, and there are many open the brown and the white morphs and morphs. Sure, and we can ask where in the country isn't do we see more white or brown or intermediate ones, and anybody welcome to browse the more than 1,000 photos geotagged and the data of these species to answer new questions that may come up. Birdwatch already, and you watch birds, note them down. I invite you to get involved with this endeavor for all of us to collectively contribute to learning much more about the birds of. You can look at websites for identification. We profile bird watchers. We run challenges, and of course the platform that we use, the platform, is eBird, global platform. An India portal of that, which for watchers, free to get in touch if you like at this email address. Thank you.
Sohail and Ashish, insights into do more productively and contribute to the larger world of conservation out there. I'd like to thank and Sujan for organizing this very short panel discussion. We are looking at these more we can do better with constituencies, and mention that I with environmental NGO called Kalpavriksha, and I feel that did when we were growing up, where we took a bird walk and showed birds, and you got hooked on bird watch. I feel in schools and in colleges to do these activities as experienced bird watchers and photographers who really have knowledge. It's very important to reach out to young. They're at a highly experience at this age can convert to a conservationist or even a scientist. Highlight. One is that I think, like Ashish was saying, it's not important just to be able to identify. That's like checking off a bird on your list, but observing the behavior, looking at the plant interactions. What is a bird feeding on? What are the predators that it's hiding from? What are the behaviors, competitive behaviors with other species? What is the call like? It's important to observe for extended period of time, and within those observations, a number of questions can be created, which children can talk about and discuss. I think in these COVID times, all of us have realized how valuable it is to just observe in your backyard all of the things that are coming and going. So I think this is actually a time when we can do a lot as well. One of the things I found very rewarding is to have a long-term relationship with a given nature club or a school, where you go in on a, not on, very frequently, but even if you're able to go in once a year, twice a year, you have that relationship which is rewarding to both sides. You bring your long-term knowledge of that area, and the teachers gain from having somebody reliable and coming and talking to children. So I think it's worth it developing that relationship with children, with schools where you can go in and work often. One of the things I wanted to flag here was that village schools are highly underserved. The kids are extremely keen to do things. They already observe a lot of birds because the environment is green, and there are fields and forests, so they are observing. And when I was volunteering with the Uttarakhand Bird Festival, I realized that even 1 or 2 walks with the village children was life transforming for them. They would register for one walk, but then they would come for every walk. Even if the group became too big, we would allow them in because they were so enthusiastic. So I think it's really rewarding to work with village schools, and I think they really need more from us. When many of us spend our summer holidays in nice cool locations or in summer cottages, those are the periods when you can actually reach out to the schools and colleges around you and try to do something with them. So the other thing that I wanted to talk about was, apart from education and outreach, what can bird watchers do about reaching out and making the larger public aware of the issues? I think a lot of us right now are very concerned about the new projects that are being planned in places like very remote, which places that we thought were very remote, like Dibang Tiger Reserve in Assam, and in Arunachal Pradesh, and the Dibru-Saikhowa wetland, areas in Assam. When these kind of problems arise, we realize how little information is out there that is published in any form, that is, available to build a case for restoration, for protection against some of these infrastructural projects that can be quite destructive. So for such documentation, I do feel that we can do a lot more to document what we have. And one of the ways of doing this is writing checklists. Now, eBirds, of course, has provided a fantastic platform where a lot of information can be collated and used. Checklists also serve a similar purpose, but they have the added advantage of providing a context to the whole issue. So if you are, say, going and birding in Corbett Tiger Reserve for many years, it's worth it to try and publish a checklist. There are a number of platforms for publishing checklists, such as Journal for Threatened Taxa. We have the Journal of Bombay Natural History Society. We have Indian Birds, of course, a very old publication. And I agree, it's not easy to publish checklists. I've had a lot of trouble myself. You need to verify each and every species. You need to find out the latest taxonomy. You may need the help of scientists who are used to the zoological names. But it's really important that these long-term observations get published somewhere. I remember when I started research on Sariska Tiger Reserve, all I had to go on was one descriptive article in JBNHS and one published checklist in Folktale. And that was all. And I thought, for a tiger reserve, that's very little information. So I think all of us have this duty to put our information out there, put our information on eBirds. I can't emphasize that enough, but also try and write about your long-term experience in a particular place or a site, which can be useful to other people for various purposes. And I can explain some of the, one of course is the rare and endangered species. The more you go to the area, the higher the chances of seeing those rare and endangered species. So it's good to write about them. You can also start or join a campaign, against some of these destructive projects that are coming up at a very high pace. We need to have that scientific information out there in order to, build a case for protection of these areas in the long term. We can also provide information to all those environmental lawyers out there who are trying, against all odds to, protect all of these places, we can send our information to them. We can send our verified checklist to them. We can help them write reports. We can help them collate data. So this is something that every amateur bird watcher can do if he or she has been in this game for a long time. It's really worth looking at. The other is that, in your area where you go to birdwatch very often, you could link up with the NGOs that are active on the ground. Many of the NGOs in these areas, in these remote areas, do not really need that technical expertise to come up with, reports and checklists that are, important to them. They also need more, information about these places. They probably do not have enough people to do it for them. So I can't emphasize enough, documentation is very important. I think both Ashish and Suhail have also mentioned this. Please feel that you have a duty to publish whatever information you have in whatever form you can. It's really, really important. And this goes for even the students who are now getting into biological studies. It's true for many of the other groups. So I think these are the ways in which we can contribute much more. And there are a lot of people who are willing to collaborate. So thanks for listening. And I hope that there will be questions too later. Thanks.
Thank you, Ghazala. I think now Sarala is on for the next.
A very good evening to everybody who's come for this webinar. And I think it's my honor to be talking to you and also to be part of this very eminent panel. And thank you to Birdwatchers Society actually for organizing this. This just came over, this was organized over a message that me and Sujan, we were exchanging, saying that, bird watchers have been there for such a long time. And a lot of time what happens is a lot of people, they just take very, very good photographs nowadays. I think I keep teasing all of them saying that, they carry their big lens bazookas around and then they, take their bird photos and then there's a checklist made and then you just move on to another place. Somebody recommends, oh, this place in Arunachal is good for so-and-so species. And then there is a beeline for that. So I was just wondering, this is a very big and a very, formidable force because there is such a, large human resource who are, experienced in understanding birds, in recognizing, identifying, knowing bird habitats. So how can we, use such a big, human resource, such a big citizen science to do a lot of more, conservation work, because that is what is needed, as you can see, especially now after post-COVID in the so-called new normal that we say, there is going to be a lot of, impetus on growth, and many of our natural, sites are going to suffer. We are already hearing about, Dibru Saikwa or Dibang Valley, and many such areas are going to come. So we as citizen bird watchers, what kind of a role can we play more in conservation and more actively? And I think we owe it, that we have to do this for the birds, for the species and the habitats. So what I've always, felt is that, birders are one of the most well-traveled people, I find them. They've been to some of the nooks and corners of this country, even like Northeast India, or even for that matter in Darjeeling, Kalimpong areas, where I know I've lived here all my life. I've never been to some of the areas that, some of the bird watching people have gone. So I think they have there is such a huge knowledge base, which can be utilized in, conservation. And also what I've always seen is birders repeatedly visit a certain site. So one recommends to the other. And so there is constantly, for example, in our studies in Namdafa on the critically endangered white-bellied heron, every year there are birders who come, who observe the bird, and then they just pass on the information and go. And then there's some other group coming next year. But every year there is it's almost like a repetition. So that's what a researcher would do, you know. We would go and you know, do replicates. We would go 1 year monitoring a transect, then we would do another monitoring a transect. But we as researchers with just 1 or 2 field assistants, we are limited. But imagine the number of birders that can go to a place, bird watching people can go to a place, visit that place year after year after year, and imagine the information base that this formidable group has on a particular habitat, on a particular region, on a particular species. So that's pretty amazing, no? And then how can we use this, you know? Not just keeping it with yourselves, also keeping it in eBird is also fine, or any of these platforms are fine. Even publishing is fine, but I think we can do much more than that, even in terms of action in the field. So many times, many birders would just photograph birds. They make a checklist, as I said, about the species, and then they just move on. And I think my previous speakers, like especially Ashish at the beginning, also said that why don't we also, you know, record habitats? Because after all, it's the habitat which is very, very important for the bird. The habitat is not there, then many of these bird species are not going to be there. So I think documenting habitat, one way of doing it is, you know, contributing is documenting habitat characters, habitat status, because a lot of people are visiting that place year after year after year. So actually it's the bird watching fraternity which can see even the trends from what that habitat was 5 years, 10 years ago to what that habitat is now. I talk to a lot of birders here who do it in North Bengal and who keep on telling me about how wetlands have, you know, degraded over here, how what it used to be like 10 years ago and what it is like right now. So there's a lot of, you know, information and knowledge over there. The other thing is, like Ghazala has already said, you know, we can actually partner with the local organizations, even local government, you know, at a DFO level or a range officer level, which I think I'm sure many of you are already doing it. But I know of people who are doing it in North Bengal. And I've been part of some of these groups. Like I remember even as a bachelor student, you know, some of it's actually, they have inspired me also so much, because people like Ranjit Mitra from Siliguri used to literally take us to areas around, you know, Gajal Doba and all those areas, just to take us to many of these places where the irrigation department was setting up canals. And I don't know, like, you know, we used to just go and chat, argue. And then even now, I see a lot of, you know, inspiration from them because they are concerned about habitats. So I think there is a lot. And then they've also actually adopted a small, you know, wetland where they are trying to restore the habitat. I think a lot more bird watching, the bird watching community can do this a lot more. And I think even at the village level, you know, you can still organize a lot of programs, like Ghazala has already said, for the school children and all that, but even for local communities. So in Assam, when we were working there, and in Arunachal Pradesh in the Zero Valley, we actually, and in Buxa actually, we asked Bishop Priya Rahot, who's also one of a very ardent bird watcher, and I think he became a resource person for us in Assam, in Manas, and we were able to run these 2-3 days of, you know, he taught these ordinary village people to actually identify birds. And 1 or 2 of them are now local guides, so they have an employment over there. So it just not, this knowledge of bird watching, therefore, does not only bring conservation, but it also helps to actually give employment, a kind of a livelihood option to so many of these communities. And I think a lot more people have to, you know, do that, have to get engaged in that. So a lot of awareness programs, not only to schools, but also to villages and also to farmers. I think that can be done. If you can do it on your own, these are all very low cost, but there are organizations there who would, I'm sure, welcome such, you know, expertise. The other thing I've always said, and I've seen a few people doing it. For example, I said people like Ranjit Mitra and their group. But I think a lot of the bird watching community needs to do little bit of advocacy and a little bit of soft kind of activism. to save at the local levels, to save, habitats. Because many of these, we look at our cities, we look at some of the, habitats around our cities, wetlands, they're being converted to something. I think we need to play, because we have so much of knowledge, that we need to play a more proactive role in terms of also being activists, not in that Zindabad kind of a way, but with the knowledge we have, with the data we have, the information we have, and about what we know about these birds and about what we know about the importance of these habitats. I think we have to, I haven't seen too many, maybe there are, but I think in the areas that I know, I think we have that, we have the ammunition to do that. And I think somehow we have to get involved in a little bit of advocacy at the local level with the government, with some organizations. But most of you are, again, organized into either groups or clubs or societies like this. So I think it's important to do that. And I think also there are opportunities where, even some bird watching group could probably adopt a habitat. I'm sure you all are doing, but I think that's a very good strategy and a contribution. You can adopt a certain habitat and, keep on monitoring it or doing some conservation work in it or advocating for it. I think in a small way that also, it leads up to a very big conservation outcome. I know it's going to be very difficult for just the bird watching community to go and fight with the union government or with the dam companies and say that, oh, there are important birds here, you should not be making a dam, or you should not be making a road or a rail across these things. But I think these areas, if we can adopt and monitor and conserve even small habitats together, I think we can make a very big, impact, a conservation impact. And that, of course, will not only benefit the birds, but all the other species, and the wider conservation outcome is, to achieve the wider conservation outcome. The other thing I also wanted to talk about is, many of us we like to watch birds, but many of us are concentrated either in, very good habitats like protected areas or reserve forests, and many of us like these critical habitats like either wetlands or grasslands. And I think sometimes we try and we don't give so much importance to many of these socio-ecological landscapes that we say, and especially in the hills or in the mountains or in the foothills. I think these are really important habitats where, these villages are in the fringe of some good forest, or they have their own private forest or community forests. And you see a lot of birds over here, because I say that because we are working on one such project where a researcher is actually documenting birds all across socio-ecological landscapes in this agro-ecosystem. When I say that, it's an agriculture ecosystems. And we are amazed to see the diversity of birds that are there in these kind of landscapes. So I think those are also very, very important habitats which we need to conserve. And what we've also seen is that we all know, and it's really linked, because what work we are doing by documenting birds, knowing more about them, is really closely linked to human well-being. Because, birds, as all of you know, birds are, again, big pest control agents. So they play a very, very big role. That is an ecosystem service, as we say, that they provide to humanity. Because the service of pest control, if they did not do that, then, we would be losing, I think, so much of crop. And also, there would be so much of food shortage and whatnot, and all those knock-on effects would be happening. But at the same time, on the flip side, there is a little bit of literature. I think there's very little in India on, we have really not, I think they've evaluated insects pollinating plants and food crops and all that, and the benefits of having insects in your agro-ecosystems. But there's been very little work and literature on really evaluating the services that birds provide to the agro-ecosystem. But there seems to be a lot of information, because on the flip side, there is a so-called, disservice kind of a thing, that birds also actually are pests, many of these birds. So like Suhail, for example, mentioned the peafowl, our national bird. But if you talk to communities about peafowl in Sikkim, they are really annoyed because they have, I mean, there's so much of peafowl and they're just eating up people's grains and whatever they're growing. So they're just invading their cultivation, their fields. So again, there is this, I think there is so much expertise there. So how do we, manage these things? Can some bird watcher who's really good at behavior be an expert and help communities in even managing these? Maybe it can provide some ways of mitigating these. So you all, I think we all, and all bird watchers are even experts because you have so much of experience. There's so much of documentation of behavior. There's so much of documentation of, there's so much of experience of their ecology, the way they behave and all that. So perhaps even in these kind of situations which involves a lot of people's livelihoods, we can still play a very, very proactive role. The other thing is, many bird watchers that I've seen, and in Arunachal Pradesh also I've seen, a lot of them are also tour operators. They run tours. I know Sujan does that, and Bishwajit, and then I know a lot of people in Arunachal, I know quite a few people who do that. And I think this is such a rising, although COVID has, kind of impacted tourism a lot, but I think this is one of the most upcoming activity, as you can see, when people are moving more and more out of these small towns and crowded cities. So we have a very, very big opportunity over there that, we take this craft, we also teach it to people in these locations, and produce more and more people like yourself, people who are interested in birds, who are passionate about birds. And I give the example of two people that I am really impressed by, who started off like really as some, a cook and a labor in a certain company. And then they rose up to be one of the most, one of the, the best upcoming birders. And I know a lot of you know them. They are Lobsang from, I think, the Eagle's Nest and Dombe. So, they've been able to learn and take it up. And so also the example in Manas. So a bird watcher, a birding person taught them the craft, and then they took it up to another level. And now it's livelihoods for them. I mean, they're making a life out of that. And I hope we can, these can be replicated more by the bird watching community. And I think I can not emphasize more involvement in training and more involvement in awareness. And in the end, I think it's for all of us to, think, and it's all of us to, ask ourselves how best can we contribute to society, because all of us have this shared heritage, which is nature. So how best can we contribute to society through nature? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarala. Thank you all for this fascinating session. I will throw open the forum for questions. If anybody has any queries, you can either unmute yourself and tell the question, or you can write it out in the chat box. I can do this on behalf. And while the questions come, I can tell you a few things. Like from our point of view as the society, we, as you speak, currently are trying to get a small wetland which is very next to salt lakes. Last few days we have been going there and we have been taking photographs, and we have already got through eBird a checklist for over the last few years, and we are doing a bit of documentation of the not just the birds but the plants, the amphibians, and other small creatures over there, and we'll deposit the detail to the Biodiversity Board of West Bengal, and we'll see if this can be protected. In fact, the same thing that Sarala was mentioning, that using our birdwatchers' knowledge to protect a habitat. In fact, the good thing for those who are in West Bengal, those who have logged in within West Bengal, is that the West Bengal Biodiversity Board has asked us that if you have a habitat which is outside the protected areas, and you think is bird diversity or any other diversity is very important and is worth saving, please make a full-on documentation of the place, the lat long, the area, some photographs, and you can deposit it directly with the biodiversity board, and they will look into it if it can be protected. I mean, if we try 100 places, maybe 10 can be protected. That itself is a plus, a bonus to us. So, thank you all. No questions are coming in. If anybody wants to add something to...
There are questions. Sujan,
Yes.
there are questions.
Okay.
I think you should just
How
go
can we
through the chat.
coordinate? How can we coordinate and bring in traditional knowledge system in birding? That's one question coming.
This is Wahid from ex-forest officer. My question to Ashish. Am I audible, Ashish?
Yes, yes, Mr. Wahid. How are you?
Yeah, fine, thank you. Of course, I've been listening. I joined a little late, and there was some audio problem in between. But I'm sure if you can recall, Ashish, we have done extensive observations and have recorded our observations in the wetland areas in Warangal district, if you recall.
Yes.
I mean, looking at you and listening to you, I was reminded of some of the very hot spots of migratory birds. So now you might be, because I have not gone later on because I was away from Warangal most part of my remaining surveys. So what's your observation, Ashish? Any change in the habitat, any pattern of the migration? And if your answer is going to be long, you can communicate to me over email, because I don't want to eat up other.
No, it won't be long. If I may interrupt, the fact is that I haven't gone there much myself after our birding together. But maybe eBird has an answer. If people have gone to the same location, then one can search the location on eBird, and data from subsequent visits by other people will be available. Mr. Wahid.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's one thing, because of course the observation recording of our observation habitat changes, and are of so much of importance when we have to talk on scientific lines when a project comes up, maybe a road widening project or something, because when working in Nirmal area around 2007, I was confronted with a project to lay a bypass road through the forest, and the area was good habitat for leopards, but
right.
There were no scientific record to show that the leopard sightings were there, or it's a habitat for rare and endangered birds. So the observations and the recording of our observations cannot be overemphasized.
So many times records that are made by people like us are uploaded onto a public platform, wherever it is, or published in a paper. The problem is that whenever projects come up, those who are given the job of finding out about the fauna and flora may not go through all the data may not be available to them, and it's a hurried job generally. That's why they slip out on mentioning or even going through what is already published. I think that is an issue, but perhaps we can take this up separately, and there might be other people too who want to ask questions.
I agree with you.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Thank you, Mr. Wahid.
Okay, thank you. And there's another question: how can we coordinate and bring in traditional knowledge systems in birding? This one maybe to Ghazala. This is from Ghazala.
There's something happening. I didn't write that question.
There are multiple Ghazalas in the team, so we don't know who's asking, but I'll address this for Ghazala anyway, because she's the one who's into traditional knowledge.
Hello.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think, it's really interesting.
The person
One of the things,
I think, talking.
Oh, okay.
Ghazala is talking.
Oh, okay.
So my name is actually Arunima. I don't know why is it showing me as
Okay. Hi, Arunima.
Hi. Yeah, so I actually work in Pithoragarh, the Kumaon Himalayas. Although I've been working on the governance aspect of One Panchayat, but alongside I have also been birding. And when I ask people these questions about, I'm an amateur birder. I don't know much about it, just learning. So their traditional knowledge system is very strong, in that part. That is what I have found till now. So like, even if they would not know this term called climate change, but they know how it is happening and how flora and fauna has shifted from lower altitudes to higher altitudes because of increase in temperature and stuff. So that is something I really wonder, that how can we bring their knowledge systems and also the modern scientific knowledge together and then work towards the betterment or better policies and better techniques in conservation, not only in birding, but other sense also. So that's my question.
Yeah, I think it's a really important question, and I can talk about Uttarakhand because our group of birders is trying to do some things here in different sites. So one of the ways we realized, I mean, everybody knows there's traditional knowledge out there, but nobody has bothered to actually talk to people, to document these stories, to figure out the relationship between people, how they view different species and so on. So there are several groups in Uttarakhand, including one in Pithoragarh, where people are documenting all these things and, in the form of bird tales. So talking to the older people, talking to the women particularly, and noting down all of these things, and then at the same time trying to encourage the local youth to talk to the elders and find out these stories and see what connection they have to our view as scientists of those particular species. So in fact, one of the places where I've started working recently, which is Mukteshwar, we've actually managed to get the rural youth to start documenting all these stories and at the same time encouraging them to upload photographs and calls and so on, where they can sort of see whether the merger, where the common middle ground can be. So I think it's a very basic first step. There are other related issues that can be worked on, like edible weeds. I'm very active now on this Facebook page of a friend of mine, Neena Sengupta, who works in Auroville, where you're simply talking about all of the weeds that people use. So, because everything is interconnected, it's very important to get this knowledge out there. So the first step is really documentation, I would say.
Thank you.
We have another question from Kamakshi. This is how do you account for the difference in effort at the global scale while making the migration maps? I suppose this is for Suhail. Yeah, this involves mapping. And do you consider the detectability of birds while assessing the population or trends? Example, peafowl is easier to detect than other small birds.
Yes, good questions both. Can you hear me, Sujan?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah. Okay. Really nice questions. Actually, for the migration maps, there's no difference. We don't take into account difference in effort, and that's why you will see very sparse reporting across Central Eurasia, Russia, and so on. There are lots of birds, I'm sure, but there are very few people. Something more complicated would be needed to take into account that. So the maps are meant to just give a general indication of where birds are coming from, where they're going. But they're not meant to depict any kind of abundance of the birds. If we wanted to depict abundance, we would have to control for observer effort. For the second question, for detectability of birds, of course, yes, they do differ between peafowl and small birds. And that's why in the State of India's birds, there's no comparison made between the reporting frequency of different species. Instead, the trends are looked at within a species. So you look at the reporting frequency of peafowl before the year 2000, and then look at the reporting frequency of the same species in, let's say, 2018, and look at the difference in reporting frequencies. So if we assume that the detectability is remain the same for that species, then one can look at how the abundance has changed. And it's that change which is compared across species, not the reporting frequencies themselves. I hope that makes sense.
Yes, yes. Thanks a lot.
Well, yeah. And there is another question, I think, again for Suhail. This is from Kushankur Bhattacharya, one of our bird watchers from Kolkata. What could be the reason for the decline in population of scavengers, as was shown in the trend in eBird?
Yeah, so you may know that for vultures, the gyps vultures in particular, that the decline is linked very strongly to poisoning by diclofenac. Diclofenac is an anti-inflammatory drug that's given to cattle. And of course, when vultures eat the cattle ingested, it turns out to be very toxic for vultures. And so that seems to be the primary, by far, primary reason for vulture declines. If you mean other scavengers that aren't vultures, and there are of course some vultures that aren't declining as quickly, some vultures seem to be less susceptible to diclofenac. It's not really known. It looks like the availability of carcasses has also declined a lot in the last few years, maybe because vultures have declined. People are burying the carcasses much more. In some cases, they're mandated, municipal corporations and village councils have made it mandatory for carcasses to be buried because there haven't been vultures around, and it looks like the stray dog population, the feral dog population, has been increasing as a consequence. So it looks like the availability of food also may be decreasing, but we're also not sure about the susceptibility of other kinds of scavengers to diclofenac and other medications that livestock may ingest. So that's an open question right now.
Thank you so much. There are no more questions anymore. I mean, from here. So
there is one on habitat fragmentation. There's someone who wants to know about the impact of habitat fragmentation. Maybe Ghazala could.
Okay. Yeah, sure.
Bird ecologist, yes. Somebody has asked over there,
Okay, I didn't see that question, but yeah. So what's happening is that with all of this development happening, in the larger landscape, all of the continuous forest fragments are turning into bunches of, a group of smaller fragments, which are separated by possibly highways or settlements or maybe even agriculture. So what that does to birds is that, the viable area for them to breed and so on reduces. Of course, birds can fly and use several fragments at the same time, but there are many species that are very, very specialized, and they do not venture out of their fragments. They cannot get into the open. And so it ends up creating unviable populations, because every small fragment can only have a smaller number compared to the larger landscape that can have lots of individuals. So smaller populations become unviable unless there's a lot of dispersal. The other problem is that it often causes inbreeding, and one of the major effects that's happening is that at the edge of these fragments there's a different kind of a habitat, right? It becomes an edge habitat. So the proportion of edge habitat in the landscape increases, which is the place where the forest meets agriculture or forest meets the city, the concrete boundaries. So those kind of edges can have a lot of deleterious effects on birds, which can go up to 500 meters into a forest patch, as much as 300 to 500 meters. And what are the kinds of effects? One of the things that has been studied is nest predation. The number of nests that are destroyed, the number of the mortality rate of fledglings goes down, mortality rate goes up in these areas, just because that edge has been created. So overall, it's a very difficult scenario for not just birds, but a lot of different groups of animals.
Thank you. I mean, this on this context, there was this classic example a few days back. Rajat Bhargav, he was showing a video on the breeding of the finch buyer, and his video showed all the jungle crows predating on all the nests. I mean, he was completely flabbergasted because that's the rarest buyer you have, and there was this huge bunch of jungle crows sitting on top of each of the nest and taking out each chick and eating it up simply because their whole habitat is now on the fringe and next to the village with all the garbage, and the crow population has gone up. So yes, I think that's a classic example. I mean, of this. There's another question. This is any effect noticed on bird population because of the rampant light at night uh, in the cities, of course?
Yes.
So,
and Ghazal.
I think Ghazala has to reply to this.
Suhail.
Suhail, okay, Suhail.
Both of you, I think.
Okay. Yeah, I think that there's very little work being done in India on this. There's a lot of work done in North America and Europe, for example, showing that light is indeed a major impediment, especially during bird migration. Many species of birds migrate during the night, and the bright lights from cities can disorient them tremendously and lead not only to them going astray, but also to colliding with buildings. There have been some fascinating studies on this in North America, I know. Light pollution is a problem for a wide variety of biodiversity, not only birds. But apart from, in my understanding, apart from the effect of light pollution on sea turtles and their hatchlings, we don't have any studies on effects of on other biodiversity in the Indian context.
Okay. There's another question. This is about the kabutaras, the bird feeding grounds in Ahmedabad, and they are constructed in between the hustle bustle of the city. So, is it appropriate to construct it anywhere, or they should be built somewhere in a quiet place? I think this is the pigeon feeding that is there.
I think feeding of birds has to be completely banned everywhere. It creates places for opportunistic bird species to come in and feed, and expand their populations enormously, like miners, crows, and pigeons. These are very, they're highly dispersive and competitive birds, and they displace a lot of other species. You just talked about the crows preying on fledglings. We just cannot have this, but there's a lot of religious feeling associated with this, so we have to figure out a way of dealing with this.
Yes, I mean, this is just next to my house. Every morning, at least 20 people come with a kilo of grains to feed the pigeons behind my house. So there are like at least 200-300 pigeons being fed every morning. There's another question from Shravan Kumar Raila. I have a request regarding eBird. So that's for Suhail, of course. For including habitat while enumerating of bird accordingly, birds with habitat, and standardizing the habitat labels, like as we do when we log in for eBirds and updated, the lists. Yeah, something even I would like to, at least if there is a possibility of one time describing a new habitat, a new location, a description of some sort. Yeah, Suhail.
Yeah, the description of the habitat, of course, you can put in the checklist comments. But I think the question is about having some well-defined habitat types and being able to choose from those and report the habitat type when you're birding. And I've heard this request from several people. eBird, the people who developed eBird decided earlier on that the simpler they make the system, the better, the more likely people are to use it. And one reason they've not, there are multiple reasons not to include habitat. One is that it's very difficult to describe habitat except in an extremely broad sense. You know that when we go birding, we pass through many different microhabitats. There'll be a pond, there'll be a grassland, open patch, there'll be a forest. What habitat do we add? We put all habitats. It's very confusing. That's one reason. The second reason is that they believe, and I think more or less I agree, that habitat is best assessed by satellite. We have eyes in the sky all the time. There's satellite remote sensing. And for those who want to analyze the bird abundance or distribution, I think they would rather do a systematic and common analysis across all the different sites where people are reporting birds using satellite imagery, rather than the habitat descriptions as provided by bird watchers. What bird watchers are good at are what we report, which is the species that we see and the numbers that we count and the behavior of the birds. So I think as bird watchers, the notion is, let's focus on what we can do, which no satellite or anybody else can do, and let the remote sensing zone deal with the rest of it. So we are free of that. But of course, we are very welcome to put in descriptions of habitat. One thing that might be of interest to you is that eBird is considering adding the ability to add habitat photographs, which might actually be a better solution to this. But they are right now in preparation for that. They have to come up with some guidelines for habitat photography. Not just anybody just randomly photographs something and then puts it there. For it to be useful in a more serious sense, habitat photographs need to also be consistent and taken in a particular manner. So that's going to happen not very soon, but maybe in the next year or two.
Thank you. There's one more question. I think Ashish is getting let off very easily. He's not been targeted at all. So I'll address this question to him. Why do individual migratory birds return to the same place, even if the same plot of land? And we had this experience with Siberian ruby-throat around Calcutta. This is Anirban Bhaduri from Calcutta who thrown this question. So I'll ask Ashish to address.
Bird watchers still use hunter's terminology, huh? Sujan. Okay. So birds do return. I suppose it's inbuilt in their genes. When they breed in a place, they do return. Even migrants return every year to the same place. I've had a grey wagtail return for 3 years within 1 or 2 days in November. And how did I know it was the same bird? Because it was lame. And every year it came within, 1st November or 2nd November or like that. So they do have a homing instinct and they do come to the same place, especially if the place has not changed. If they still find the food that they want there or the breeding area is the same, they do come.
Thank you so much. So I think we are at the end of our time limit. We are almost 7:30 now. So again, thank you all for being part of this panel. This has been most informative. I'm sure me and Sarala will cook up some more programs to rope you in and get some more stuff out of your head. So me and Sarala are always conspiring to who to get next, and I hope you'll to see you again. So thank you so much for coming and being part of this program. So
birders do not rope people in. Birders set up mist nets.
Well, set up mist nets. Yes, we'll set up a mist net next time. Yes, definitely.
How are you?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Right.
Thank you, Sarala.
Yes.
Thank you, Sarala.
Stay well, stay safe. Happy
Ashish.
birthday, everyone.
Thank you.
Right.
Happy birthday.
Yes.
Thank you. It was informative, Ashish. Yeah.
Thank you.